Welcome everybody. In this video we're going to go through the whole securitization process in a bit more detail compared to what happened in the previous recording. I will be showing you basically a step-by-step version of that process as discussed in your curriculum. It's not necessarily very difficult, but there are end of chapter questions on the various steps or roles involved, and the way those questions are presented are precisely is precisely the way I'm going to do it as well. So sit back, relax. It's not going to be necessarily very difficult, but something you have to get the logic of. Right, so let's begin with the company who's going to be the originator of the whole need to do a securitization. We're going to call this, as your curriculum does, the operating company. So I'm drawing on the left hand side here, operating company. Now let's imagine it's not a bank. Your curriculum uses the example of a car manufacturer, okay. So a company. So that company, what it does is, of course, sells its products. So first thing here, first step is the sale of products. In this case, those products would be cars to customers. So I'm going to have customers over here on the right hand side. Car buyers, I guess, buying the cars. Okay, and the customers are not going to be paying in cash. The sale of the product, is going to be financed by loans, allowing the customers to buy. Okay, so that's going to be our first step, and I'm going to do the steps in these oval shapes, whereas the players, the people involved, the institutions involved in boxy rectangular shapes. Right, what has to happen next is, that's step number 2, is the sale of those loans. Of course, the sale of the loans, as you should know by now, is or happens to or the buyer is a special purpose entity, an SPE, and what the SPE does or is able to do is pay cash for the loans acquired. So here is a cash payment for the loans back to the original operating company, and that's going to be my step number 3. Okay, we've dealt with sort of the left hand side over here. Let's now focus on the right hand side, or actually not yet the right hand side. Let's deal with where the SP gets the money from to make that cash payment to the original sort of car manufacturer. Well, as you know, it gets that cash from investors, because what it will do is, of course, that's going to be step number 4. It's going to issue and sell ABSs. So here's an issuance and sale of asset-backed securities to the investors. This is step number 4, by the way, and investors pay cash. Step number 5, cash payment for those asset-backed securities flowing back to the SPE, which is how it funds the payment for the loans. Now, next step, on the left hand side we still have some space, because the customers who purchase the products, in this case it will be cars, will be making periodic cash flows, won't they? So they will be making periodic cash payments on their loans. Number 6, the step is periodic cash payments, obviously, which are related to having taken loans out, and those will be paid here, but well, those will that those will be associated with the loans, and I guess they will be more or less processed by the SPE. But what the SPE will now do is take the money and use it to make payments which will go to the investors. So step number 7, periodic cash flows, going all the way down to the investors. Okay, like you would with what we said before, for example, with pass-through securities. Of course, the money flowing to the investors will have certain adjustments to it, deductions, for example, due to fees which are collected by services, etc., etc. Right. So that's the process, more or less, 7 steps instead of the previous 4 or 7 distinct steps here. This is the way the curriculum presents it, like in terms of the outline. And it actually asks you questions in the end of chapter section on where would you put, which bubble would you put this activity or this person or this entity into. So you kind of get your head around the idea of how this looks. If they ask you questions, it should look the same. Now, let's think about the parties to the whole, to the securitization. Who's involved? Well, first of all, we've got the original company that was selling the product up here. And we said it's the operating company on the left-hand side here, the car manufacturer. Well, that is the seller of assets, the seller of the loans, because they make the loan and which gets sold to the SPE. The seller of assets, that's the loans. They're also known as the depositor. That's what your curriculum says. Okay. Now, that's the first one. The second one is going to be the SPE, special purpose entity, who is the issuer of the ABSs themselves. Issuer, of asset-backed securities over here. And then a third, let's say, institution, party that may be involved is potentially the servicer of the loans. That's going to be the one who looks after all the payments, processing, etc. Very often it's going to be a specialist financing subsidiary of the operating company, so of the seller, right? But I'm going to leave this. This is not really so important right now. What we have to focus on is I wanted to highlight, not cross out. I want to focus on the SPE, the special purpose entity, because your books do contain some interesting and important notes here. First of all, the SPE is going to be a separate entity, independent entity from the operating company. The operating company is, of course, the seller in our three-party breakdown. And it's very important that this separation and independence is upheld. Why? Because in the case of the bankruptcy of the seller, if this company up here, the car company, for example, goes bankrupt, it's important that the SPE still stays afloat and it still stays unaffected. So we often say that the SPE is a bankruptcy remote entity. It shouldn't be affected by the bankruptcy of the asset seller or the operating company. It shouldn't be affected, right? And this legal separation of the two businesses is absolutely critical, right? I'm writing exclamation marks here because you want to decouple, you want to separate the credit risk of the seller from the bonds being issued. Okay. In theory, the people buying the asset-backed securities, these investors at the bottom, they shouldn't really worry about the financial health of the operating company. That shouldn't impact them, because once the SPE holds the loans, it's all about whether these customers will be making their periodic payments, which will then be used to make periodic cash flows to the investors. They shouldn't have to worry about the condition and health of the operating company. That's the logic. The only risk is the credit risk associated with the borrowers, the clients who bought products. However, it has to be said that the actual legal status of ABSs does vary quite a lot by jurisdiction. In many countries, the securitization process creates a genuine sale, so there is no legal questioning of whether the SPE is the owner of the assets. Of course, aside from instances where there may have been some fraud involved, where obviously the courts may decide otherwise, but other than that, in many countries the securitization creates, as I said, creates an absolute true transfer of ownership. It's deemed to be a true sale. In other countries, this may not be so obvious, and it can be more questionable what happens to the assets held by an SPE in the case of the bankruptcy of the seller. Hence, there are countries where this has become a more popular way of funding, and in others, it hasn't really taken off that much. It does have a lot to do with the way the transaction is interpreted in the context of a given legal framework. Okay, let's just say that there are a few of other parties involved, so other people. Those will be for sure always lawyers. Typically you'll get accountants in, credit agencies, who'll rate the ABS as being issued. We call these collectively third parties because they're not directly neither the seller nor the SPE or nor are they the servicer. Okay, just a few additional notes on the documents involved in the whole process. Now, normally, whenever you issue bonds, and after all, ABSs are a type of fixed income instrument, you've got your standard bond indenture, a document we talked about in one of the very early videos in the fixed income section of the curriculum. But here you'll have two additional documents which are quite specific to ABSs on top of the classic bond indenture, and that's going to be the purchase agreement, this being the document between the seller of the assets, the seller of the securitized assets. Remember, this is also known as collateral. And the buyer of them, which is the SPE. Okay, and why is this important? Because it contains, or it outlines, all the representations, so descriptions as well as assurances, the warranties, so to speak, made by the seller. So the seller, in this case, in our previous little graphical representation was the operating company. They kind of say, oh, the pool contains such a collection of receivables, and they go on to describe what those receivables are like, who's on the other side, who's the borrower behind those receivables, etc. And of course, that description is then available to investors, and it's the way in which investors can build any or get any sense of how likely it is that the customers will actually make their periodic cash payments. So made by the seller about the assets being sold, or the assets sold. These are the loans after all. And these representations and these warranty, as I said, they are supposed to assure investors about the quality of those assets. Okay. Another document here, I said there would be two, is the prospectus. And the prospectus describes sort of more the structure of the whole transaction, the structure of the securitizations, So especially when you've got something a little bit more complex, the priority of payments. In terms of, for example, the credit enhancements being used, who bears what risks, which class of bonds gets money first, who gets money later. They also describe any amounts to be paid to the servicer for doing their job, and any administrators, okay, and obviously what goes to any amounts to be paid to servicer and investors as well, of course. Right. Yeah, I think that's enough for the documents. Just looking at my notes to the side here. Yeah, there's just one little additional topic, and it's going to be over for this video. What your curriculum also discusses is the role of the so-called trustee here, or the trustee agent. And they kind of say this is somebody going to be called the disinterested trustee, but don't worry, don't have to learn this, I think. This role is going to be the role of the trustee or trustee agent. It's a role played by a financial institution, and they will kind of intermediate. On the one hand, they will safeguard. So the role is safeguarding the assets sold to the SPE, keeping them safe. But also, all that money, or the money which is paid by customers, those periodic cash flows, they will actually also hold that money temporarily, holding the funds to be paid to investors before they actually get transferred to the investors. It's the trustee who holds them kind of safe under their custody. And an additional function which they do as a result is that they also provide independent reporting, provide reports on cash flows to the ABS investors. Because they're disinterested, they are independent, they're supposed to be absolutely objective, and they will provide periodic reporting to the investors, and it's really the only way in which the investors can gather what's going on. And you should trust this trustee, because the name does convey that message that they are doing things independently. Nobody's holding anything back or telling you sweet little lies about how well the asset portfolio is performing when it's really not.